The smell of disinfectant filled every corner of the medical wing. David Walsh wrinkled his nose as he walked past rows of glass enclosures, each one housing small dragon hatchlings that lay curled up and unmoving. He had only arrived at Gateway 3 days ago, excited to start his job running a small restaurant for the station's mixed population. Nobody had told him about the dying children that a nurse from the Orvani species, tall and gray-skinned, with 4 precise fingers on each hand, moved between the enclosures with a tray of nutrient paste. The paste glowed faintly green under the medical lights. David watched as she opened one enclosure and placed a small dish inside. The hatchling, no bigger than a terrier with copper-colored scales, didn't even lift its head. David had taken a wrong turn looking for the supply depot. He should have kept walking, minded his own business, but something made him stop. Maybe it was the complete silence. These were babies, weren't they? Babies made noise. These didn't. "Excuse me," David said. The nurse turned, her large black eyes studying him with the kind of look that suggested he was interrupting important work. "What's wrong with them?" "They won't eat," the nurse said simply. She moved to the next enclosure. Same routine. Paste in a dish. Hatchling ignoring it completely. "We've tried 17 different nutritional formulas. All rejected. How long has this been going on?" "For months since the first cases. Now we have 42 hatchlings in crisis." The nurse's voice carried no emotion, just facts. 3 have died. Starvation, essentially, though they have food available at all times. David felt his stomach twist. He stepped closer to one of the enclosures. The hatchling inside had scales that might have been bright emerald once, but now looked dull and flat. Its ribs showed through its sides. Small wings lay folded against its back like crumpled paper. "Can I ask why they're here?" "On the station, I mean. The Drakri have a mining operation in this sector. Many families relocated here for the work. The hatchlings were born here or brought here young." The nurse closed her tray. "If you're looking for the depot, it's 2 levels down." She walked away before David could ask anything else. He stood there for another minute, looking at the rows of glass boxes and the small, still forms inside them. Then he left, but he couldn't stop thinking about it. His restaurant sat in the station's commerce ring, a modest space with 10 tables and a kitchen that barely fit 2 people. David had spent the last 2 days getting everything ready, learning where supplies came from, figuring out the equipment. He was supposed to open tomorrow. He'd planned a simple menu. Comfort food, the kind his grandmother used to make. Stews, roasted meats, fresh bread. Real food, not synthesized. That evening, a Drakri couple came in just as David was closing. They were tall, easily 7 feet, with scales that shimmered deep blue in the light. Their eyes were gold, slit-pupiled, ancient-looking. They moved with the kind of grace that came from being apex predators for millions of years. "We heard a human would be cooking here," the female said. Her voice rumbled like distant thunder. "We wanted to see if it was true." "Opens tomorrow," David said. "But I can make you something now if you're hungry." They exchanged a glance. The male spoke. "We are Shera and Corvin. Our daughter is in the medical wing. She hasn't eaten in 6 days." David's hands stilled on the cloth he'd been using to wipe down a counter. "I saw the hatchlings today. I am sorry. The doctors say they're doing everything they can." Shera's voice cracked slightly. "But she's dying. They're all dying, and nobody knows why." David pulled out 2 chairs. "Seat, please. Let me make you something to eat, and you can tell me about her." Over the next hour, while David cooked a simple beef stew with vegetables and herb from Earth's seed stock, Shera and Corvin talked. They described their daughter, Nira, how she'd been bright and curious before the sickness, how she'd chirped and played with other hatchlings, how she'd stopped doing all of that 3 weeks ago. "In the wild, on our homeworld, hatchlings are fed by their parents," Corvin explained. "We chew the food first, soften it, mix it with our saliva. It helps them digest." "The doctor said that's unsanitary," Shera added bitterly. "They have better methods. Scientific methods. But their methods are killing our children." David served them the stew. They ate slowly, carefully, clearly and used the human food, but too polite to refuse. When they finished, Shera looked at him with those gold eyes. "This was made with hands," she said. "Not machines. Yes, David confirmed. What? David thought about how to explain. Because food made by machines tastes like machines made it. Food made by someone who cares tastes different. My grandmother taught me that. Shara and Corvin left soon after, thanking him quietly. David cleaned up the kitchen, but his mind was elsewhere. He kept thinking about what Corvin had said. Parents feeding their young, not just for nutrition, but for connection. The next morning, before opening his restaurant, David went back to the medical wing. He found Shara there, sitting outside her daughter's enclosure with her hand pressed against the glass. The small hatchling inside hadn't moved. "Can I try something?" David asked. Shara looked at him with eyes that held no hope left. "Try what?" "Let me cook for her. Real food, not paste. And let you be there when she eats it. The doctors won't allow it. Then we'll ask them to make an exception." David knelt beside her. "What's the worst that can happen?" "She's already not eating." Shara studied his face for a long moment. Then she nodded once, sharp and decisive. "I'll speak to them." David didn't know if it would work. He didn't know anything about dragon biology or alien nutrition. But he knew about cooking and he knew about love, and he suspected those two things might be exactly what these hatchlings needed. 3 days of meetings with doctors, administrators, and committee members finally ended with reluctant permission. David could try feeding one hatchling under strict supervision with documented results. If anything went wrong, he'd be held responsible. He stood in his kitchen at 4 in the morning, surrounded by research files he'd spent 2 nights reading. Dracary biology was complex. Their digestive systems ran hot, needed high protein, required specific minerals for scale development. But none of that explained why they were starving themselves. David had asked to observe a regular feeding session first. The medical director, an Orvani named Trell, had agreed with obvious reluctance. So at 6 that morning, David stood in the medical wing watching nurses prepare the feeding routine. Everything was precise. Temperature controlled, paste dispensed in exact portions. Each enclosure opened on a timer. Nurses worked in teams, moving efficiently from one hatchling to the next. The whole process took 20 minutes for all 42 hatchlings. David watched the hatchlings during this. Most didn't even lift their heads when the food appeared. A few sniffed at it, then turned away. One small brown-scaled hatchling crawled to the dish, touched it with its nose, and retreated to the corner of its enclosure. The paste sat there, perfectly balanced nutrition, completely untouched. "You see," Trell said, "we provide everything they need. They simply refuse it." But David noticed something else. In one corner of the wing, a Dracary father sat outside his son's enclosure. The father had his palm pressed against the glass. The hatchling inside sat on the other side, palm to palm through the barrier. The little one's eyes were fixed on his father's face. "How often are parents allowed to visit?" David asked. 1 hour per day. More would disrupt the medical routine. And they can't go inside. Contamination risk, Trell said firmly. These hatchlings are malnourished. Their immune systems are compromised. David nodded slowly, but his mind was working. He thought about human babies, how they needed touch, warmth, the presence of caregivers. He thought about studies he'd read once, about infants in orphanages who had food and shelter but still failed to thrive without human contact. After the feeding session, David asked Trell if he could review security footage from the early days, before the hatchlings got sick. Trell seemed puzzled but granted access. David spent the next several hours watching recordings in the early footage. The hatchlings were different. They moved around their enclosures, climbed on the furniture provided, chirped at each other through the glass. And during parent visits, they pressed against the barriers trying to get closer. Parents would breathe on the glass, and the hatchlings would follow the fog their breath created. Something clicked in David's mind. He pulled up more research files, this time focusing on Dracary social behavior. He found references to scent bonding, to chemical signatures unique to each family group. Hatchlings recognized their parents by smell as much as by sight. The synthesized food had no smell. Well, it had a smell, but it was the same for every batch. Sterile. Perfect. Identical. David left the medical wing and went to find Shara. She was in her quarters, a small space in the residential section. When she opened the door, she looked like she hadn't slept in days. I need to ask you something, David said. On your homeworld, when you feed hatchlings, do you breathe on the food first? Shara blinked. Yes, of course. The warmth helps, and our scent calms them. Why? Because they're not just refusing food. They're refusing food that doesn't smell like family. Understanding dawned in Shara's eyes. The synthesized paste has no scent markers, right? And they're separated from you by glass. They can see you, but they can't smell you. They're babies, Shara. They're scared and alone, and everything smells wrong. Shara sat down heavily. We told the doctors this. We explained our feeding practices. They said it was primitive superstition. It's not superstition. It's biology mixed with psychology. David pulled up a file on his datapad. Human babies show measurable stress responses when separated from primary caregivers. Their cortisol levels spike. They eat less. Some even die, despite having adequate nutrition available. We call it failure to thrive. And you think that's what's happening to our hatchlings? I think they're grieving, David said quietly. They're mourning the connection they've lost. Shara looked at him for a long moment. Then she stood. When do you want to try feeding Nira? Tomorrow morning. But I need you to help me prepare the food. Your hands, your scent, your presence. That's what she needs. That evening, David tested recipes in his kitchen. He used real meat from the station's agricultural bay, bone broth he'd been simmering for 2 days, finely ground mineral supplements. He made small batches, varying the texture, the temperature, the consistency. Nothing synthesized. Everything made by hand. Shara arrived around midnight. David showed her what he'd prepared. She sniffed each dish, her sensitive nose analyzing components David couldn't even detect. This one, she said, pointing to a thick porridge-like mixture. The scent is closer to what we'd prepare naturally. Can you add to it? I mean, can you handle it, breathe on it, make it smell like you? Shara cupped her hands around the bowl. She breathed across the surface, slow and deliberate. Then she stirred it with one claw, her scent glands on her wrists leaving traces in the food. When she handed it back to David, it smelled completely different, still edible to him, but now carrying an undertone of something wild and warm. Tomorrow, David said, we'll make a fresh batch. You'll prepare it with me, and we'll feed Nira together, with no glass between you. Trell will never allow that. Trell gave me permission to try one feeding my way. He didn't specify the details. David smiled. Sometimes it's easier to ask for forgiveness than permission. Shara's expression shifted into something that might have been a smile. It showed a lot of teeth. You're either very brave or very foolish, human. My grandmother used to say the same thing. David started cleaning up the kitchen. She also used to say that rules matter less than results. If this works, Trell can complain all he wants. They spent another hour refining the recipe, testing temperatures, adjusting consistency. By the time Shara left, they had a plan. It might fail. Nira might reject the food, just like she rejected everything else. But at least they were trying something different. David lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling of his quarters. He thought about his grandmother's kitchen back on Earth, the way she'd cooked with her whole heart. She'd never had fancy equipment or exotic ingredients, just simple food made with love. She used to say you could taste the difference. Tomorrow, he'd find out if dragons could taste it too. Trell's face went through several shades of gray when David and Shara walked into the medical wing, carrying a covered pot, and asked to enter Nira's enclosure. Other doctors gathered around, speaking in rapid clicks and whistles. The argument lasted 10 minutes. This violates every protocol, Trell said. Your protocols aren't working, Shara replied, her voice low and dangerous. My daughter is dying. In the end, they compromised. Shara could enter the enclosure. David would stay outside, but could pass items through. A medical team would monitor everything. If Nira showed any signs of distress, the experiment ended immediately. David watched through the glass as Shara stepped into her daughter's space for the first time in weeks. The change in Nira was immediate. The small copper-scaled hatchling lifted her head. Her nostrils flared. She made a sound, something between a chirp and a cry. Shara knelt down, making herself smaller. She didn't rush forward. She let Nira come to her. The hatchling crawled slowly across the enclosure floor, weak but determined. When she reached her mother, she pressed her face against Shara's chest and made that sound again, over and over. David had to look away for a moment. Several of the medical staff did the same. Even Trell's expression softened slightly. After a few minutes, Shara looked toward David and nodded. He passed the bowl through the access port. Shara took it, cradling it in her hands. The food inside was still warm. They prepared it fresh that morning in David's kitchen. Meat cooked tender and shredded fine, mixed with rich broth and minerals. Shara had stirred it, breathed on it, infused it with her scent. She held the bowl out to Nira. The hatchling sniffed it cautiously. Her small forked tongue flicked out, tasting the air. She looked up at her mother, then back at the bowl. She didn't eat. Not yet. David felt his heart sink. Maybe this wouldn't work after all. But Shara did something David hadn't expected. She dipped her claw into the food and brought it to her own mouth, tasting it. Then she offered the bowl again. This time, Nira leaned forward. She touched her nose to the surface of the food. Her tongue came out again, taking the smallest taste. Nobody in the medical wing breathed. They all watched as the tiny hatchling took another taste. Then another. Then she dipped her whole face into the bowl and began to eat. Slowly but deliberately, Shara's eyes closed. Her whole body seemed to sag with relief. She kept one hand on Nira's back, steady and warm, while her daughter ate. It took 15 minutes for Nira to finish half the bowl. Then she pulled back, curled up against her mother's side, and fell asleep almost immediately. Remarkable, Trell said quietly. Her vital signs are already improving. David slumped against the wall. His legs felt shaky. It worked. Once, Trell corrected. Let's see if it continues to work. It did. Over the next 3 days, Nira ate regular meals. Each time, Shara prepared the food with David's guidance, adding her scent and warmth. Each time, she fed Nira while holding her, touching her, being present. The hatchling gained weight. Her scales brightened. Her eyes grew clearer and more alert. That be why the 4th day, other Dracary parents had heard what was happening. They gathered outside the medical wing, demanding the same treatment for their hatchlings. Trell tried to maintain order, but desperation broke through every protocol. Corvin approached David in the corridor outside his restaurant. My son, Reth, hasn't eaten in 8 days. He's worse than Nero was. Please. David looked at the tall Dracary father. Corvin's scales were normally deep blue, but stress had dulled them to almost gray. His hand shook slightly. I can't cook for all of them, David said. There are too many. Then teach me. Corvin's voice broke. Teach me to cook for my son. That stopped David cold. He'd been so focused on proving the concept worked that he hadn't thought about scaling it up. But Corvin was right. The solution wasn't David cooking for 42 hatchlings. The solution was parents doing it themselves. Okay, David said. Come to my kitchen tonight. Bring your partner if you have one. We'll practice. Corvin arrived that evening with his partner, Syrah. They were both engineers, used to working with precise calculations and mechanical systems. Cooking confused them at first. David showed them how to prepare simple meat porridge, how to test temperature by touch, how to adjust texture by sight and feel. But what's the exact ratio of meat to liquid? Syrah asked. There isn't one, David explained. You adjust based on what feels right. If it's too thick, add more broth. If it's too thin, let it cook longer. That's incredibly imprecise, Corvin said, frowning. Yes, that's the point. David stirred the pot on his stove. Cooking isn't chemistry. It's art mixed with intuition. You'll make mistakes. The food won't be perfect, but it'll be yours, made with your hands, and that's what Reth needs. They practiced for 2 hours. The first batch was too salty. The second was too thick. The third was closer. By the 4th attempt, they had something that smelled right. Corvin tasted it, adjusting the seasoning one more time, and nodded. This is acceptable. It's better than acceptable, David said. It's made with care. That matters more than perfection. The next morning, Corvin and Syrah fed Reth for the first time in over a week. Like Nira, he was hesitant at first, but with his parents there, holding him, offering food they'd prepared themselves, he ate. Not much, but enough. Enough to begin healing. Word spread faster after that. David found himself running impromptu cooking classes in his restaurant after hours. Drackery parents crowded into his small kitchen, learning to chop, stir, and simmer. They asked countless questions. They made countless mistakes. They learned. Some of them complained that it was beneath their dignity. Drackery were warriors, scholars, leaders. They didn't do menial tasks like cooking. David listened to these complaints with patience. On Earth, he said, cooking for someone you love is one of the highest honors. My grandmother cooked for me every day when I was young. She was brilliant, could have done anything with her life. She chose to feed her family. She told me there was no greater purpose than that. A female Drackery named Vessa spoke up. But we have technology. We have systems that can do this better, faster, more efficiently. Can they do it with love? David asked simply. The kitchen went quiet. Vessa looked at her hands, at the knife she was learning to use, at the meat she was carefully cutting. No, she said finally. I suppose they can't. By the end of the second week, 20 hatchlings were eating regularly. Their parents had learned to cook simple meals, had learned to be present during feeding, had learned that sometimes the old ways existed for good reasons. The medical wing began to feel less like a morgue and more like a nursery. Trell remained skeptical, but couldn't argue with results. The hatchlings were improving. The science was clear, even if it wasn't what he'd expected. David stood in his kitchen late one night, exhausted but satisfied, and thought about his grandmother again. She'd been right. Food made with love tasted different. Even dragons could tell. The transformation happened slowly, then all at once. Within 3 weeks, every hatchling in the medical wing was eating. Some still struggled, some needed more time, but none were actively dying anymore. The change was undeniable, but something else was happening that David hadn't anticipated. The Drackery parents were changing too. He noticed it first during cooking class. A father named Bellic was preparing broth for his twin hatchlings. David watched as Bellic tasted the broth, added a pinch of salt, tasted again. The concentration on his face was absolute. This was a male who'd commanded mining operations across 3 systems, who made decisions affecting thousands of workers daily. Now he stood in a kitchen, completely focused on getting the seasoning right for his children's dinner. Is this correct? Bellic asked, offering David a spoonful. David tasted it. What do you think? I think it needs something. I'm not sure what. Trust your instincts. What does it need? Bellic frowned, thinking. Then he added a tiny amount of a mineral supplement they'd been using. He tasted again. His expression shifted. Better. Yes, that's better. There you go. You didn't need me to tell you. But I've never done this before. How'd I know it's right? David smiled. You know because you're their father. You know them better than anyone else. You can feel what they need. Later that day, David overheard a conversation in the medical wing. Sierra was talking to another mother, showing her how to test food temperature. You have to touch it yourself first, Sierra explained. The machines measure degrees, but you measure whether it feels right for your child. Every hatchling is different. The other mother looked uncertain. But the guidelines say the guidelines are for machines. You're not a machine. Neither is your daughter. Sierra demonstrated, dipping her claw in the food, testing it against her own tongue. See? It's warm but not hot. Comfortable. That's what you're looking for. David realized what was happening. The Drackery weren't just learning to cook. They were learning to trust themselves as parents. For months, they deferred to experts, to technology, to systems and protocols. They'd stopped listening to their own instincts. Now, they were remembering how he shared this observation with Shara one evening. She'd become something like a friend over the past weeks, often stopping by his restaurant to help with the cooking classes or just to talk. We've always prided ourselves on progress, Shara said, on being advanced, civilized, better than our primitive ancestors. But somewhere along the way, we lost something important. What's that? The understanding that some things can't be improved by technology. Some things have to be done with hands and hearts, the way they've always been done. She looked at her own hands, scales gleaming in the kitchen light. My grandmother used to cook for me when I was young. I thought it was because we were poor, didn't have access to better options. Now I wonder if she knew something I forgot. A few days later, Trell called David to his office. The medical director looked tired, but less hostile than before. He gestured for David to sit. "I've been analyzing the data," Trell said. "The hatchlings who are recovering fastest aren't the ones getting the most nutritionally optimized food. They're the ones whose parents spend the most time in physical contact during feeding. That doesn't surprise me. It should. It defies conventional understanding of nutritional science." Trell pulled up charts on his display. But the correlation is undeniable. Touch, scent, presence. These factors affect digestion, hormone levels, stress responses. The hatchlings aren't just eating food. They're absorbing security. "Food is never just fuel," David said. "It's comfort, connection, love." Humans figured that out thousands of years ago, and we Irvani forgot it, apparently. Trell leaned back in his chair. "I'm writing new protocols based on these findings. Not just for Dracary hatchlings, but for all young of all species in institutional care. Mandatory parental involvement in feeding. Physical contact requirements. Allowances for cultural feeding practices that were previously dismissed as inefficient." "That's good. That'll help a lot of children." "It's humbling," Trell admitted, "to realize that we've been wrong, that our advanced systems were missing something so fundamental." He looked at David. "Why do you think we missed it?" David considered the question. "Because you were looking at bodies, not souls. You measure nutrition, but not nurturing. You can't put love in a spreadsheet, so you decided it didn't matter. But it does. It always has." That evening, David stood at the entrance to the medical wing and watched the feeding time routine. It looked completely different now. Parents sat inside the enclosures, holding their hatchlings, offering food they prepared themselves. The hatchlings ate slowly, comfortably, making soft sounds of contentment. Some fell asleep afterward, curled up against their parents' warmth. Nira had been moved to a regular enclosure 2 days ago, no longer in critical care. David watched as Shara fed her daughter, the little copper-scaled hatchling eating eagerly now. Nira had gained enough weight that her ribs no longer showed. Her scales shone. Her eyes were bright and curious. When Shara noticed David watching, she smiled and waved him over. He entered the enclosure, and Nira immediately scrambled toward him, chirping. She'd learned to associate him with food and comfort. She climbed up his leg, surprisingly strong now, and settled on his shoulder. "She likes you," Shara said. "The feeling is mutual." David gently scratched behind Nira's small head ridges. She rumbled, a sound like a tiny engine. "How's she doing?" "Perfect. Better than perfect." Shara's voice was thick with emotion. "You saved her life, David. You saved all of them. I just cooked some food." "No, you did more than that. You reminded us what it means to be parents. You gave us back something we'd lost." Shara looked around the medical wing, at all the other families feeding their young. "This is how it should be. This is how it always should have been." David stayed for a while, talking with various parents, checking on different hatchlings. They all had names now. Before, when they'd been dying, many parents had been afraid to name them. Now, every hatchling had a name, an identity, a future. As he left the medical wing, he passed by the small memorial wall where 3 names were engraved. The hatchlings who hadn't made it, who died before David arrived. He stood there for a moment, silent, thinking about them, hoping they were remembered, hoping their deaths had meant something. That a hand touched his shoulder. Corvin stood beside him. "My son asks about them sometimes," Corvin said quietly. "The ones who didn't survive. I tell him they were brave, that they tried their best. They were just babies," David said. "They shouldn't have had to be brave." "No, they shouldn't have." Corvin's voice was firm. "And because of you, no more hatchlings will have to be. We'll remember how to care for them properly. We won't forget again." David nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. They stood together for another moment, then walked away, leaving the memorial to its quiet vigil. The medical wing had never been designed to be a kitchen, but that's what it became. Trell, after much consideration and several long reports documenting everything, approved the installation of proper cooking facilities. Small stoves, prep areas, storage for fresh ingredients. The synthesizer units were moved to the back, relegated to backup status. David walked through the space on a morning 6 weeks after that first successful feeding with Nira. The change was remarkable. Where there had been silence and sterile efficiency, there was now noise and warmth. Parents worked at various cooking stations, preparing breakfast for their hatchlings. The air smelled like meat, herbs, warm broth. Like home, a young Drackery male named Torvin called out to David. "Does this look right?" He held up a bowl of something that resembled oatmeal, but was made from ground proteins and bone meal. David came over and looked. "What's it for?" "My daughter, Kess. She's teething, needs something soft but filling." "Let me see her." Torvin led him to an enclosure where a small, green-scaled hatchling was gnawing on a rubber toy designed for exactly this purpose. When she saw her father, she dropped the toy and chirped excitedly. "The texture looks good," David said, "but it seems a bit thick. Add some warm broth. Make it easier for her to swallow while her mouth hurts." Torvin nodded and adjusted the recipe. He brought the modified food back to his daughter, entering her enclosure and sitting with her. Kess ate slowly, carefully, making small please sound between bites. When she finished, she climbed into her father's lap and promptly fell asleep. Torvin looked up at David with wonder in his eyes. "She trusts me. She feels safe with me." "Of course she does. You're her father." But before, when I'd visit, she barely recognized me. The glass was between us. I couldn't hold her, couldn't touch her. I was just a face she saw sometimes. Torvin stroked his daughter's scales gently. "Now I'm real to her. I matter." David left him there, holding his sleeping daughter, and moved on through the wing. Everywhere he looked, he saw similar scenes. Parents and hatchlings together. Families reconnecting. It was beautiful and heartbreaking at the same time, because it showed how much had been missing before. In one corner, he found a group of mothers working together. They'd formed a kind of cooking circle, sharing recipes and techniques. Vesa, who'd initially protested that cooking was beneath her dignity, was now teaching 3 other mothers how to make a particular broth that her son loved. "You add the herbs at the end," Vesa explained. "If you cook them too long, they get bitter. My hatchling has a sensitive palate. He notices everything." "How do you know when it's ready?" another mother asked. "You taste it. Multiple times. You adjust until it feels right." Vesa demonstrated, tasting, thinking, adding a pinch more salt. "There. That's good. Here, try it." They passed the bowl around, each mother tasting and discussing. It reminded David of his grandmother's friends, gathering in the kitchen on Sunday afternoons, arguing about whose recipe was better. The same energy, the same camaraderie, just with scales instead of skin. Shara approached him, carrying Nira on her shoulder. The hatchling had grown noticeably larger, healthy, and strong. "I wanted to show you something," Shara said. She led him to a different section of the station, away from the medical wing. They entered what appeared to be a recreational area for Drackery families. Several adults sat around tables, while hatchlings played in a supervised area nearby. But the interesting part was what the adults were doing. They were cooking together, sharing recipes, teaching each other. One father demonstrated knife techniques. A mother showed others how to test oil temperature. They were building a community around food, around care, around the act of nurturing their young. "This started organically," Shara said. "Parents who met in your cooking classes kept meeting outside them. They wanted to keep learning, keep improving. So they created this, a place to practice, to share, to help each other." David watched as a nervous-looking father received encouragement from others, being coached through making his first solo meal for his hatchling. The community supported him, offered suggestions, celebrated his success. When his daughter ate the food enthusiastically, everyone cheered. "This is bigger than food, isn't it?" David said. "Much bigger. You gave us permission to care openly, to admit we didn't know everything, to ask for help. Drackery culture has always valued strength and independence. We saw asking for help as weakness." Shara shifted Nira to her other shoulder. "But now we understand that caring for our young together, supporting each other, sharing knowledge, that's not weakness. That's the strongest thing we can do." Over the next week, David noticed other changes. Hatchlings who'd been isolated in individual enclosures were now housed in small groups, mimicking natural clutches. They played together, learned from each other, developed social skills. The ones who'd been sickest had mentors now. older hatchlings who'd recovered first and could show them how to eat, how to play, how to be young dragons. The medical staff adapted to these changes. Trell implemented new protocols that balanced medical necessity with family needs. Regular health checks happened during parent visits, not separately. Treatments were explained to parents, not just administered. The Dracari were involved in every decision about their hatchlings' care. One evening, David held an advanced cooking class. 20 Dracari parents attended, eager to learn more complex techniques. They weren't just cooking anymore, they were becoming skilled at it. Some showed genuine talent. Others struggled, but kept trying. All of them cared deeply about improving. Bellic, the mining operations commander, had become particularly skilled. His twin hatchlings had specific dietary needs, and he'd learned to modify recipes to accommodate them. Now he taught others how to do the same. The key is understanding the why behind each ingredient, Bellic explained to the group. Once you know what each component does, you can adjust and substitute as needed. It's like engineering, really. Each element has a function. David smiled at that. Trust an engineer to find the logic in cooking. Whatever worked. After the class, several parents stayed to clean up and talk. They'd become friends over these weeks, bonded by shared experience and purpose. They traded stories about their hatchlings, complained about teething problems and sleep schedules, laughed about cooking disasters. They were building a support network, something that hadn't existed before. Syrah approached David as he was washing dishes. "I want to thank you properly," she said. "You saved my son's life. Our entire culture owes you a debt." "I just showed you what was already there," David replied. "You did the actual saving. You and all the other parents. Still, you were the catalyst. Without you, Reth would be gone. All of them would be gone." Her voice grew thick. "I'd forgotten how to be a mother. I let experts tell me what my son needed instead of trusting my own heart. You reminded me that I knew all along." David dried his hands and turned to face her. "Can I ask you something? Why did you stop trusting yourself?" Syrah thought about this. Because everything else in our lives became so advanced, so technological. We could automate everything, optimize everything. It seemed foolish to rely on instinct when we had data. But instinct is data too, isn't it? Just a different kind. The kind that comes from millions of years of evolution, from love, from connection. Exactly that, David agreed. She nodded slowly. "We won't forget again. This generation of parents will teach the next. We'll pass down these skills, these traditions. Cooking for our young, being present with them, trusting ourselves. It'll become part of our culture again, the way it should have been all along." David looked around his restaurant-turned-classroom at the Dracari parents working together, learning together, caring together. He thought about his grandmother. Wished she could see this. She'd always said food brought people together. She'd been right in ways he'd never imagined. News traveled fast through the Galactic Consortium. Within 3 months, delegation from 6 different species arrived at Gateway 7 to observe the Dracari hatchling recovery program. They all had similar problems. Young ones failing to thrive in institutional settings, despite having every physical need met. David found himself giving tours of the medical wing, explaining the philosophy more than the techniques. A representative from the Kalari species, who'd lost 12 offspring in similar circumstances, took extensive notes. "But how do we convince our people to do this?" the Kalari representative asked. "Our culture values efficiency above all else. Asking parents to spend hours cooking when synthesizers exist seems wasteful. Is it wasteful if it saves lives?" David countered. "Is it wasteful if it builds stronger families? Sometimes the efficient path isn't the right path." The representative looked at the Dracari parents working in their communal kitchen, at the healthy hatchlings playing nearby, and nodded slowly. "I see your point." Trell published his findings in major medical journals throughout the consortium. The response was mixed. Some praised the innovative approach, others dismissed it as regression. But the results spoke for themselves. 0 hatchling deaths in 3 months. Complete recovery in 95% of cases. Improved parent-child bonding metrics. Better developmental outcomes across all measured categories. Other stations began implementing similar programs. David received requests to consult, to teach, to help establish protocols. He declined most of them, recommending instead that they find their own solutions based on their own cultures. The specifics didn't matter as much as the underlying principle. Love couldn't be automated. 4 months after that first feeding with Nira, the Drackery Council held a formal ceremony. David stood in a large assembly hall, uncomfortable in formal clothes, while hundreds of Drackery filled the seats. Shara stood at the podium, speaking in her native language. Translators provided the human equivalent. We gather today to honor David Walsh, human chef and friend to our children. He saw what we cannot see. He understood what we had forgotten. Through his guidance, 42 hatchlings survived who otherwise would have perished. Through his wisdom, we remembered what it means to nurture with our own hands. She called David to the stage. He walked up, feeling every eye in the room on him. Shara held out a pendant, a beautiful piece of metalwork showing a dragon coiled protectively around small hatchlings. "This is the mark of clutch, friend," Shara said. "It has never been given to a non-Drackery. It means you are family to every hatchling born from this day forward. It means our children are your children. It means you will always have a home among us." David accepted the pendant with shaking hands. He tried to find words, failed, tried again. "I don't know what to say. I just cooked some food." Gentle laughter rippled through the audience. Shara smiled. "You did far more than that. You gave us back ourselves." The ceremony continued with testimonials from parents whose hatchlings had recovered. Corvin spoke about Reth, who was now healthy and energetic, constantly getting into trouble. Torvin showed recordings of Kess taking her first flight. Vessa shared how her son had started trying to cook with her, mimicking her movements with tiny claws. Afterward, there was a feast. Naturally, the Drackery had prepared everything themselves, traditional food from their homeworld mixed with new recipes they'd learned. David moved through the crowd, accepting congratulations, watching parents proudly show off their healthy children. Nira found him eventually. She was big enough now to barely need Shara's help moving around. She climbed up David's leg and settled on his shoulder, her favorite spot. She'd adopted him as much as he'd helped save her. "She'll miss you," Shara said, appearing beside him with a plate of food. "Miss me? I'm not going anywhere. Aren't you? Your contract was for 6 months. That's almost up." David realized with surprise that she was right. He'd been so focused on the hatchlings, on the cooking classes, on building this community, that he'd lost track of time. "I suppose I could extend it." "You should. You've become part of this station's life. My people would be upset if you left." Shara paused. "I would be upset if you left. Then I'll stay, at least for a while longer." In truth, David couldn't imagine leaving now. His small restaurant had become something more than he'd ever planned. A gathering place, a teaching center, a community hub. He'd arrived expecting to serve food to strangers. Instead, he'd found purpose. Weeks passed. The hatchlings continued to thrive. Several reached developmental milestones early. Their doctors attributed it to the improved emotional environment. New hatchlings born on the station went straight into the updated care protocols, never experiencing the isolation that had nearly killed the earlier generation. The cooking community grew beyond just parents of young hatchlings. Adult Drackery without children started attending classes, learning for themselves or to help others. Food became a shared language, a way to build connections across the station's diverse population that David's restaurant expanded. He hired help, both human and Drackery. They created a menu that blended Earth cuisine with Drackery preferences. The place was always full, always warm with conversation and laughter. Parents brought their hatchlings for dinner. Friends gathered for lunch. Families celebrated birthdays and achievements. One evening, David stood in his kitchen watching the dinner rush. Bellick was at table 6 with his twins, teaching them to use utensils properly. Torvin sat at table 3, his daughter Kess perched on the seat beside him, carefully eating soup. Sira and Corvin had pushed 2 tables together to accommodate their extended family group. I in the far corner, a new human arrival ate alone, looking overwhelmed by the crowd of dragons. David made a note to introduce himself later, welcome them properly. Everyone needed a community. That was another thing his grandmother had taught him. Nira, who spent most evenings at the restaurant now, helped in her own way. She'd learned that if she was very polite and very cute, customers would slip her extra treats. She had the staff wrapped around her little talents. David pretended not to notice. Shara arrived late, fresh from a negotiation meeting. She looked exhausted. David had a plate ready before she sat down. Her favorite meal, the one he'd learned to make the way she preferred it. She smiled when she saw it. You didn't have to do that. I know. I wanted to. David sat across from her. How the negotiations go? Well enough. The mining operation is expanding. More families will be moving here. She paused. More hatchlings too. We'll need to expand the nursery facilities. I'll help however I can. I know you will. She started eating, savoring each bite. You know what's strange? I can't remember what life was like before you arrived. Before we learned to cook for our young again. It feels like we've always done this. Maybe in a way you have. You just forgot for a little while. A dangerous forgetting. One that cost 3 lives. But one you've corrected. That matters more than the mistake. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the noise of the restaurant washing over them. Hatchlings chirped and squeaked. Parents laughed and talked. Dishes clattered in the kitchen. It was chaotic and messy and perfect. David thought about his grandmother again, as he often did. She died 2 years before he left Earth, peaceful in her sleep after a long life. She'd never known about his decision to join the cultural exchange program, to cook for aliens on a distant station. But somehow, he felt like she'd approve. She'd always said food was the universal language. She'd been right about that, just like she'd been right about everything else. Love tasted different than mere sustenance. Care had flavor. Attention had texture. You could taste the difference between food made by machines and food made by hands that cared. Even dragons could taste it. Especially dragons. Nira climbed onto the table, breaking several etiquette rules, and curled up next to David's plate. He scratched behind her head ridges, and she rumbled contentedly. Around them, the restaurant buzzed with life. Families together. Children fed and happy. Parents confident in their care. This was what it was all about, David thought. Not fame or recognition or medals. Just this. Just making sure the little one smiled. The parents felt capable, and everyone had a warm meal made with love. His grandmother would have understood completely that Yendi.